Roy Tomlinson had never been the kind of man who sought attention. He wasn't one for small talk, didn't care much for community events, and preferred the quiet company of his tools over the clatter of social engagement. For over 4 decades he had lived in the same 2-story brick house at the edge of the neighborhood, a home he had built himself, brick by brick, with the same kind of deliberate patience he had used to teach his sons how to drive, how to treat people with respect, and how to hold a hammer correctly. Now, in his 70s, Roy lived alone. His wife, Lillian, had passed away 5 years earlier, and his boys were scattered across the country with careers and kids of their own. What remained was his home, his workshop, and the one thing he had never parted with, the gun collection that had belonged to his father, his grandfather, and in part to himself. This wasn't some backwoods armory or paranoid man's bunker. Roy didn't keep rifles propped up in every room or load pistols under pillows. His collection, though sizable, was legal, locked, cataloged, and impeccably maintained. Each firearm had its story, and Roy could recall the origin of every dent and scratch on their polished surfaces. He had inherited the first piece, a worn but elegant Winchester Model 1873, from his grandfather, who had once traded a wagon load of grain for it during hard times. Over the years, the collection had grown, not through wild shopping sprees or internet auctions, but through methodical curation, antique shops, estate sales, a few retired collectors he'd known for decades. There were muskets from the Civil War, pistols from World War I, a rare bolt-action rifle from a British officer who had once lived 2 houses down. For Roy, they weren't weapons. They were artifacts. American history in cold steel and aged walnut. He kept them in custom cabinets he had built himself in the basement workshop, each piece lovingly displayed under low museum-grade lighting. Some he even showcased in decorative forms out on his property. One, an antique revolver mounted inside a sealed case on a garden sculpture. Another, a flintlock replica integrated into a wrought iron gate. Nothing dangerous. Nothing accessible to anyone but him. It was art, heritage, and personal memory woven together, until someone decided it wasn't. It started quietly, the way trouble often does. A change in neighborhood leadership. A new board chair with a grin too wide and a tone too crisp. Karen West had been elected as the new neighborhood president during a spring vote that Roy hadn't even known was happening. He had never attended their meetings, never cared much for the community bylaws beyond keeping his yard tidy and his front porch light functioning. It wasn't indifference, just a lifelong habit of minding his own business and assuming others would do the same. But Karen, as Roy would come to learn, did not mind her own business. She thrived on involvement, control, and, above all, image. To her, the neighborhood wasn't just a place to live. It was a brand, and every house was a storefront window she was determined to curate. Roy first encountered Karen on a bright Saturday morning in early May. He had been sanding a piece of cedar for a new bench when she appeared at the edge of his driveway, clipboard in hand, dressed in the kind of pastel blouse and perfectly ironed khakis that screamed micromanagement. Her smile was the kind people wear when they're about to say something offensive under the pretense of friendliness. "Hi there, I'm Karen West, your new community chair," she said with the chipper rhythm of a practiced realtor. "Just doing a little walkabout to introduce myself and get to know our wonderful residents." Roy wiped his hands on a rag, nodded politely, and said, "Roy Tomlinson. Lived here 42 years. Karen's gaze drifted from his face to the front of the house, then down the driveway to where a small sculpture stood by the mailbox. It was one of his newer works, a twisted iron column with an inset display box inside which sat an 1860s cap and ball pistol, fully deactivated and permanently mounted. Roy had built it as a memorial after his wife died, a kind of tribute to the past, to his family's long American lineage. "That's quite a piece you've got there," Karen said, squinting. "Is it functional?" "Nope," Roy replied evenly. "Decommissioned. Mounted. It's art." Karen said, scribbling something on her clipboard. Well, as long as it complies with community safety expectations. That sentence lingered in Roy's ears long after she left, even as he returned to his work. Safety expectations wasn't a phrase he'd heard before, not in any official form and certainly not applied to lawn decor. He shrugged it off, chalking it up to the kind of performative concern that came with new management. But a week later, he received the first notice. It arrived in an envelope with a cheery logo and the words, "Friendly Compliance Reminder," printed in italicized blue font. Inside, the letter stated that resident Roy Tomlinson was in potential violation of Neighborhood Ordinance 14B, Sub-Clause 3, which discouraged the public display of objects resembling firearms in areas visible from the street in order to maintain a peaceful and non-threatening aesthetic. The letter urged Roy to remove or conceal any such installations within 7 days to avoid escalation. Roy read the letter 3 times. He searched for the rulebook he had received decades ago when he bought the house. There was no Ordinance 14B, no subclauses, nothing about aesthetics or the visibility of firearms. He made a copy of the letter, marked it with the date, and walked it down to the city records office the next day. The clerk there, a thin woman with tired eyes and a habit of talking while typing, confirmed his suspicion. There was no such clause in the city's or the neighborhood's registered documents. "It's either new," she said, "or completely unofficial." Roy returned home and placed the copy in a file labeled Miscellaneous Nonsense. Not because he thought it wasn't serious, but because labeling it anything more dramatic felt like giving it power. He left the sculpture where it was. 2 days later, someone knocked on his door at 8:00 p.m. It was dark outside. When he opened it, there was no one there, just a note left on the doormat, handwritten in jagged pen. "This isn't a gun range. Clean it up, or we will." No signature, no footprints, just fear, delivered with cowardice. That night, Roy walked his property with a flashlight, checking every fence, every camera, every lock. He wasn't scared. Not exactly. But something inside him, a calmness he had relied on for decades, had started to coil tighter. He made a decision then. If someone wanted to come after his memories, his family history, or his rights as a property owner and citizen, he wouldn't scream, he wouldn't threaten, and he wouldn't run. He'd do what he had always done. He'd respond with clarity, intelligence, and structure. And perhaps, if the moment called for it, with fire and smoke and ribs slow roasted over a hickory flame in the middle of the very lawn where they wanted him silenced. He didn't know it yet, but the fight was coming. Not a fist fight. Not even a courtroom battle. Something stranger. A war of paper, of policy, of public perception. And Roy Tomlinson, the quietest man on the street, was about to become the loudest symbol of resistance the neighborhood had ever seen. The morning the boxes arrived, Roy was in the middle of his usual routine, watering the back garden, tightening the latch on the shed door, feeding the cat that wasn't really his but had made itself at home over the past 2 years. The calm of the morning was shattered by the low rumble of a delivery truck pulling up in front of his house. The kind of sound that usually meant new equipment parts or a mistaken Amazon package left by someone who couldn't tell the difference between South Cedar Drive and South Cedar Court. He walked to the front, expecting some minor mix-up, but as the truck backed into his driveway and the lift gate lowered, he knew instantly that this was no ordinary delivery. 3 large gray containers, each roughly the size of a small refrigerator, were rolled off the truck on handcarts, each stenciled with bright orange tape that read, "Temporary, Secure Storage, Community Safety Program." Roy's stomach dropped as the driver approached with a clipboard in hand, asking for a signature to confirm receipt of compliance units. Roy didn't take the clipboard. He didn't even touch it. Instead, he asked calmly and firmly, "Who authorized this delivery?" The driver, a lean man in his 40s with a shaved head and a corporate polo shirt, blinked at him like a computer awaiting a command and responded, Instruction issued through Neighborhood Risk Reduction Initiative, active as of May 4th, Section 14B Amendments, Tier 2 Participation Zone. Roy didn't raise his voice. He asked again, this time slower. I didn't order anything. I didn't sign up for any tier. Who sent you here? The driver looked at his clipboard again, then flipped a page and pointed to a name typed neatly at the bottom of a checklist. West, Karen, Chairperson, Authorizing Party. That was all Roy needed to hear. He didn't threaten the driver, didn't push the boxes or block the truck. He simply said, "These don't stay here. You can leave them on the street if you want, but they don't come up that driveway." After a long pause and a phone call to an unseen supervisor, the driver nodded, rolled the boxes onto the sidewalk, and drove off without another word. Roy stood there for a moment, arms crossed, watching the unmarked containers sit like tombstones at the edge of his lawn. He took out his phone and snapped photos. Every angle, every label, every barcode. Then he walked back into his house and started making calls. He called the non-emergency city office first, wanting to know if there was any record of such a program. There wasn't. Then he called a local attorney, a man named Bryce Hollander, who had once helped Roy sort out a land boundary dispute when a new neighbor tried to build a gazebo 2 feet into Roy's backyard. Bryce was thorough, expensive, and refreshingly blunt. Roy emailed him the photos and explained what had happened. Within hours, Bryce replied with 3 documents. One outlining property rights in the state, one highlighting the legal distinction between voluntary and mandatory compliance with community guidelines, and one request for a formal cease and desist that Roy could send directly to Karen and the neighborhood board. Roy didn't waste time. He printed the letter, signed it, and hand-delivered it to the board's office, which operated out of a converted guest house on the far side of the development. The woman at the desk, a younger woman with earbuds in and a look of utter disinterest, accepted the envelope with one hand while continuing to scroll through something on her phone with the other. No greeting, no acknowledgement, just indifference weaponized into bureaucracy. Roy left without saying another word, and on the way home he passed Karen herself walking her overgroomed dog on a leash that sparkled unnaturally in the sunlight. She waved at him like nothing had happened. The next morning, the containers were gone. No truck, no explanation, no written notice. They simply disappeared, the way mistakes often do when they're quietly walked back under the cover of silence. Roy took that as a small victory, until the letter arrived. It was thicker this time, in a heavy envelope marked Immediate Community Review Action Required. Inside were 12 pages of new policy addendums allegedly voted into effect by emergency quorum, none of which Roy had seen advertised, distributed, or even mentioned. The language was vague but pointed. Phrases like object-based threats, ideological display regulation, and civic neutrality clause littered the document like landmines of meaninglessness. One page specifically named Roy's address, stating that his property has become the subject of repeated concern due to perceived representations of violence and cultural aggression inconsistent with community values. That sentence hit him like a punch in the ribs, not because he believed it, but because it showed just how far Karen was willing to twist the language. Perceived representations of violence wasn't just an insult, it was a reframing of memory, a family history, into something ugly. It was the bureaucratic version of character assassination, and Roy knew that if it wasn't challenged it wouldn't just end with him. This was about precedent, about making an example, and she had chosen him. But Roy also knew something else. You didn't win against people like Karen by shouting louder or putting up signs in your yard. You won by refusing to give them the chaos they hoped for. So, he didn't argue. He didn't retaliate. He filed a formal response through Bryce, citing legal protections, state-level preemptions, and relevant clauses from federal rulings about property expression and historical preservation. He sent copies to the mayor's office, to the city zoning department, and to a small group of veterans advocates who had once helped him organize a local memorial event. He didn't ask for headlines. He asked for accountability. Still, the tension in the neighborhood rose like heat from pavement. Cars began to slow as they passed his house, lingering a second longer than normal. Some neighbors who had always waved now kept their hands at their sides. A few even crossed the street when walking their dogs. He caught whispers outside his fence, parents warning children not to go near the gun guy's house. One woman shouted at him from her car, accusing him of being a danger to progress. He didn't respond. He just logged it, quietly building his ledger of slights. The real tipping point came not with another letter or threat, but with silence. A silence that arrived in the form of an invitation, thin, cream-colored cardstock in a gold-lined envelope. It was for the annual Neighborhood Harmony Dinner, a polite, soft-gloved affair usually held at the clubhouse patio. Roy had never been invited before. He didn't attend things like that, but this time he was not only invited, he was placed on the opening remarks list. The invitation read, "Roy Tomlinson, local historian and representative of traditional American legacy." He didn't laugh. He didn't frown. He simply stared at it, knowing it for what it was. Bait. A trap disguised as inclusion. A way to put him in front of an audience and either tame him or embarrass him, depending on how the winds blew. He placed the invitation on his workbench next to a blank sheet of paper. Then, with deliberate care, he began drafting his own invitation, one that would go out not on cream cardstock but in bold ink on a flyer pinned to every public board and mailbox in the area. An invitation to something else entirely. Something that didn't require approval or catering. Something that reminded people that freedom, history, and identity didn't need validation from a chairwoman in khakis or a committee in folding chairs. He called it the first annual Liberty Cookout, and he planned to host it right there, on the grassy commons in front of the very office where the community board met every Thursday night. If they wanted a statement, they were going to get one. Not in anger, not in defiance, but in firm, unshakable presence. And Roy Tomlinson had never stood taller. Roy spent the next several days in a deliberate state of preparation, not out of panic or urgency, but with the slow-burning patience of a man who had rebuilt a transmission in a storm with only half his tools and a flashlight in his mouth. He had seen enough in his life to know that the worst battles were never declared out loud. They arrived quietly, disguised as meetings, policy updates, and neighborly concern. And they were fought not with fists, but with whispers, forms, and the passive silence of those too afraid to take a side. He began drafting the materials for the Liberty Cookout by hand first. Lists of supplies, arrangements for music, flags, tables, parking signage, and of course, the food. There would be ribs, cornbread, brisket, sausages, and sweet tea. He didn't call it a protest. He didn't call it a statement. He just called it what it was. A cookout on public land where Americans could gather, speak freely, and remind themselves what freedom felt like when it wasn't filtered through a committee. But even as he planned, the opposition moved. Late one evening, Roy returned home from the local butcher's shop, having placed a substantial order for smoked meat cuts to be prepared in advance. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed something new. 3 orange flags staked into his front yard soil, no larger than garden markers but unmistakable. Each was printed with a QR code and a small laminated tag reading, "Pending review, potential safety violation." His heart didn't race, but his jaw clenched. He left the truck running, walked up to the flags, scanned one with his phone, and was redirected to a website he'd never seen before. A portal labeled Neighborhood Security and Adjustment Index. It was dressed up like a modern dashboard, with interactive charts and metrics, as if someone had turned his lawn into a data point in a study he never signed up for. At the top of the page, beneath the icon of a lock surrounded by a leafy green circle, were the words, "Resident, Nar Juzendun 31. Compliance threshold status, Under observation. He stood still, letting the weight of that sentence settle. It wasn't just targeting him. It was cataloging him, as if he were an infection in a spreadsheet. Below the status were vague entries like flagged interaction, historical replica visibility, social tension marker, elevated, and, worst of all, potential escalation indicator, active. He didn't need a lawyer to tell him what this was. Someone, likely Karen or whoever she'd recruited, had built a shadow system of surveillance and metrics under the guise of community improvement. Not official, not legal, but dangerous in its ability to make accusations seem like facts and perception feel like policy. Roy took screenshots of the entire page, printed them, and stored them in a thick manila folder that was already beginning to bulge. That night, someone drove past his house slowly 3 separate times, headlights off, pausing just long enough for Roy to see them but not long enough to catch a license plate. He didn't call the police. He reinforced the locks, activated the security floodlights, and cleaned his tools. Not for battle, but for symbolism. He didn't want violence. But he wasn't going to be erased by people who feared anything older than last year's talking points. The next morning brought another gift from the committee, this time in the form of a letter posted to his door with a thick red sticker marked, "Urgent Community Response Needed." Inside was a formal directive. He was being called to a behavioral impact review, scheduled to take place at the community center in 48 hours. The language, again, was intentionally vague but legally hollow. Following multiple community concern reports and preliminary behavioral audits, resident Door 31 is encouraged to participate in a cooperative evaluation process to determine the potential civic impact of property displays, verbal interactions, and legacy adherence. There were no names attached, no complainants listed. Just a series of forms, boxes to check, and a statement at the bottom, warning that non-participation may lead to reconsideration of access to communal resources. Roy placed the letter on the kitchen table, poured himself a glass of water, and sat down. He took his time. Then, after a long moment of silence, he picked up his phone and called Bryce again. "Tell me what kind of law allows this," he said flatly. "None," Bryce answered. "This is a bluff. A very aggressive, well-dressed bluff. They're trying to get you to either cave or act out so they can label you officially. Don't give them anything. I'll draft a response and I'll file it directly with the city compliance officer and the county registrar." Roy exhaled through his nose. "Good, I'm done being polite." But that didn't mean he was going to be loud. He doubled down on the cookout, expanding the invitations beyond his street. He drove to the hardware store and asked for copies of flyers to be printed. Simple, bold design, the American flag in one corner, a plate of barbecue in the other, and the words, "Join us for the Liberty Cookout. Free food, free speech, open carry welcome, respect required." He posted them in diners, barbershops, church lobbies, hardware store corkboards, places that didn't care about politics until politics tried to take away their traditions. Karen, of course, noticed. She showed up 2 days later with a clipboard and 2 men in suits, both wearing badges from a private conflict resolution firm Roy had never heard of. She didn't approach the porch. She stood at the base of the steps and called up in her crisp, performative voice. "Roy, we've received concerns that your upcoming event may not have adequate security protocols or logistical transparency. These gentlemen are here to perform a preemptive review to ensure community protection." Roy leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. "This is a cookout, Karen, not a hostage negotiation." Karen smiled, lips tight. "Nevertheless, the board insists on proactive evaluation. We wouldn't want any incidents that could be traced back to unresolved grievances." Roy nodded once, slowly. Then he stepped back into the house, returned with a piece of paper, and handed it to the man closest to him. It was a cease and desist, notarized and signed, barring any unauthorized agents from entering his property under Title V of the State Trespassing and Property Sovereignty Code. The men looked at it, frowned, and exchanged a glance. Karen tried to speak again, but Roy cut her off. "I've had enough of your euphemisms, Karen. If you or your associates step onto my land again without a legal mandate, I'll press charges. Not file complaints. Press charges." The men turned and walked away. Karen hesitated, then followed, her smile gone. But the pressure didn't ease. That night, someone dumped a pile of lawn clippings, broken bricks, and torn political flyers across his driveway. Petty, obvious, meant to provoke. Roy simply cleared it up without a word, recorded the footage, and submitted it to Bryce. A day later, two old friends, retired firefighters, showed up unannounced with a truck full of foldable chairs, canopies, and American flags. They'd heard about the cookout. They wanted in. One of them looked Roy dead in the eye and said, "We're not going to let you stand there alone." By the time the cookout day arrived, Roy had over 70 confirmed guests, including several veterans, a local sheriff's deputy, 3 small business owners, and an elderly widow who brought peach cobbler in a cast-iron pan older than half the attendees. They came not for spectacle, not to argue, but because they'd seen the quiet erosion of dignity and freedom dressed up as polite reform. And they'd had enough. Roy stood at the grill in his apron, flanked by 2 coolers of soda and a steel firebox slowly smoking through the afternoon sun. He didn't shout. He didn't give a speech. But when he finally turned around, plates of ribs in his hands, and saw the lawn filled with people who refused to be intimidated by language dressed in fake authority, he knew they'd already won something. And the real fight hadn't even started yet. By the time the smell of oak-smoked ribs had settled into the air and the sun hung low enough to cast golden shadows across the Commons lawn, Roy understood that the cookout had grown far beyond its original shape. It was no longer just a gathering. It had become a presence, one that couldn't be ignored or mislabeled without consequence. There were no chants, no signs, no speeches or megaphones. Just people, standing and eating and talking, law-abiding, neighborly, peaceful, but defiant in the most effective way possible, through normalcy maintained under pressure. The flags fluttered. The music played. Soft country ballads, old-time blues, the kind of songs that didn't demand attention but filled silence with something warmer than tension. Roy had intentionally made sure the event felt grounded. Everything about it said, "We're not extremists, we're residents, citizens, neighbors, and we are not ashamed of who we are." Karen didn't appear at first. There was no confrontation, no sudden appearance of police or clipboard-wielding board members. That would have been too crude for someone like her. Instead, it came in the form of presence by proxy. About an hour into the cookout, a black SUV pulled up slowly at the far end of the lawn and idled without ever turning off its engine. A woman stepped out. Tall, thin, in a gray suit, not local. She didn't approach. Just stood there, arms folded, observing. Roy caught the motion in his periphery but chose not to react. His response came in the form of more food. He served extra plates, handed a cold tea to a man in a wheelchair who had rolled in from 2 streets over, helped an elderly woman carry a tray of cupcakes to the buffet table. Everything he did said the same thing. "I see you, and I refuse to be threatened by you." But it was later that evening, when the crowd had thinned and the tables were being packed down, that Roy finally heard the next move being made. Not from a letter or a summons, but through an offhand comment from one of his guests. A man in his 60s, formerly with the Planning Commission, leaned in close and said, "You know what she's doing now, don't you? She's not trying to get rid of your guns. She's trying to repurpose your land. I heard she's in talks with a safety consulting firm that's actually a development holding company. They're planning to pilot some sort of community reinforcement model here, turning common areas into branded spaces, security-monitored zones, and your yard is the soft entry point." Roy said nothing, but his grip tightened slightly around the folding table he was lifting. It made sense. Too much sense. The QR flags, the fabricated policy language, the behavioral audits. They weren't about safety. They were about leverage, about devaluing property under the guise of concern until it could be extracted, repurposed, and resold in pieces. His collection, his display, his independence, those weren't the target. They were the obstacle. And Karen, for all her talk of values, was just a face for something larger. The next morning, Roy contacted Bryce again and relayed what he'd learned. Bryce didn't sound surprised. In fact, he told Roy he'd already begun tracing a paper trail. Over the past week, 3 different local parcels had transferred holding status into a corporate shell registered in Delaware, all connected through shared language in their community compliance modifications. The board had apparently passed a vote, unofficial, unrecorded, but enacted nonetheless, to begin strategic restructuring of neighborhood assets. It sounded like real estate. It was, in a way, but not through buying, through dismantling, erosion by policy, reframing culture as threat, independence as instability, and legacy as obstruction. Bryce had one more surprise. The woman in the gray suit who had observed the cookout. He'd identified her. Not a law enforcement official, not a compliance agent. She worked for a private risk management consulting group hired by developers specializing in suburban transition projects. In layman's terms, they entered aging neighborhoods under the pretense of modernization and safety, built a narrative of dysfunction or non-compliance, and bought out properties at discounted rates once residents were isolated or legally compromised. Roy didn't shout or pace when he heard this. He just stood quietly on his porch and looked out across the street, where a mother was watching her child draw with chalk on the sidewalk. He watched the slow, innocent movement of color against concrete and felt the familiar weight of generational responsibility settle on his shoulders again. His father had once said, "Men don't fight for land. They fight for what land represents." Roy hadn't fully understood that as a young man. Now he did. His yard was more than square footage. It was history, family, memory. And to some people it was an obstacle that had to be softened or removed. But Roy wasn't about to be softened. He didn't hold another cookout. He didn't call the local news. He did something quieter but far more effective. He sent formal letters, not complaints but inquiries, to the county assessor's office, to the city council, to the zoning and permitting department. Each letter requested clarification on redevelopment status, land use designations, and project filings associated with neighborhood adjustments. He filed public records requests for all documents pertaining to recent corporate inquiries made in connection with the area. He CC'd Bryce on everyone. Then he called the local American Legion post, where he had once taught a class on firearm safety, and asked to speak at their next meeting. Not to rally them, but to warn them, to let them know what was happening quietly, subtly, and with polished professionalism in their own backyards. Within a week, he received responses, some evasive, some vague, but enough to confirm that something was indeed underway. Nothing illegal, just quiet alignments. Roy marked every reply with red ink and began assembling a binder, a large one. Then, with the same calm precision he used to oil his rifles, he began drafting his next step, not for a speech or a defense, but for offense. It was time to turn the quiet pressure back on the ones who had started it, not with noise, but with paper, with laws, with the same tools they thought only they knew how to wield. The middle point of the battle was not explosive. There were no doors kicked in, no breaking points. There was only this, a man who understood, finally, what game he was really being drawn into, a man who realized that the only way to defend his land was to step out from behind it, not with a gun, but with the kind of presence that didn't need one. And the moment Roy accepted that, the balance began to shift. The summons came folded in a pale blue envelope, marked not with the now familiar emblem of the neighborhood committee, but instead with the letterhead of the local civil mediation court. It had the weight of something real this time, the kind of document that didn't speak in euphemisms or community expectations, but in the unflinching tones of docket numbers and deadlines. Roy opened it calmly, seated at his kitchen table with a mug of black coffee and a pencil between his fingers. He read through it twice, slowly, then leaned back and let the implications settle into his bones like an early frost. Karen, or someone acting on her behalf, had officially filed a complaint, not about his guns, not even about the cookout, but about the creation and propagation of a hostile environment through implied intimidation, disruption of communal operations, and unauthorized use of shared space for ideologically charged gatherings. They weren't coming after the cookout itself. They were framing it as a threat, as a symbolic act of aggression that, when combined with Roy's history of non-compliance, constituted an actionable danger to community stability. Roy didn't flinch. He picked up the phone and called Bryce, who had already received a copy. Bryce didn't sound surprised. He never did, really, but his tone had shifted slightly. Less professional detachment, more the clipped edge of someone tired of games being played with sharp objects. He confirmed that the filing was built almost entirely on interpretation and conjecture. There were no statutes cited directly, no codes violated, but it was cleverly written, crafted to force a legal process, to grind time and money from Roy's hands, to place him in the role of aggressor defending himself against nothing more than the discomfort of others. "They want to exhaust you," Bryce said flatly. "They can't beat you in logic, so they'll bury you in paper. But if they think you'll fold, they don't know you at all." Roy didn't intend to fold. He filed a formal response, accompanied by signed witness statements from multiple cookout attendees, including a sheriff's deputy and 2 off-duty firemen. He attached copies of permits for the lawn space rental, food handling compliance, and open carry acknowledgement. All legally sound, all properly submitted ahead of time. He included photographic evidence of the event's peaceful nature and logistical planning, and a notarized letter from the city council confirming no ordinances had been violated. He handed it all over to Bryce, who bound it into a sleek black folder and delivered it in person to the courthouse. But while the legal machinery turned slowly, the attacks in the neighborhood escalated in speed and venom. Someone dumped a bag of nails in Roy's driveway in the early morning hours. Another left an anonymous note in his mailbox suggesting that old men with outdated beliefs don't belong in modern neighborhoods. His trash bins were overturned twice in the same week. Surveillance footage caught shadows but no faces. He filed reports, but the response was always the same. No actionable suspect at this time. Meanwhile, the neighborhood committee began circulating a petition, not to evict Roy, which would have been legally impossible, but to reconsider his eligibility for shared benefits and participation in community programs. The language was careful, surgical. It didn't accuse him of anything directly. It simply asked whether his ongoing behavior and symbolism aligned with the evolving values of a safe and inclusive residential space. And yet, through it all, Roy remained exactly where he had always been, at home, in his yard, working on a new sculpture forged from reclaimed metal beams, arching like a flag in motion. He wasn't hiding. He was refusing to leave. He answered no provocations, issued no threats. He responded to every insult with a documented report, to every accusation with a certified reply. He made himself undeniable, unshakable. But even he didn't anticipate the next strike, which came not from the committee, not even from Karen, but from someone who had until then remained unseen. It happened on a Thursday, late afternoon. Roy had just returned from picking up lumber when he saw a city maintenance truck idling near the edge of his property. 2 men in high-visibility vests were unspooling orange cord around a portion of his lawn, staking small signs into the ground every 10 feet. "Future Site Review Area," they read. Roy approached them calmly and asked what they were doing. The older one shrugged and said they were just following a site request logged through the city planning database. Something about environmental risk reassessment related to public use structures. Roy asked who had submitted the request. The man didn't know, said it was a digital entry flagged by an environmental standards group affiliated with a local development grant. Roy took pictures, logged the time, and asked them to leave until proper identification could be verified. They complied, reluctantly. Bryce dug deeper. The request had been filed using a public planning portal under a provision intended for registered community boards and oversight committees. Someone had used a temporary digital certificate issued months earlier to Karen's office, one that had technically expired but had never been revoked. It was a loophole, exploited precisely to make it seem official without legal accountability. Bryce filed for an emergency injunction to prevent any further reviews until the court hearing was resolved. The judge granted it, noting the suspicious timing and lack of proper notification. But the message was clear. They were probing for weaknesses, looking for any opening to discredit, displace, or delegitimize Roy's presence. He was no longer just a homeowner. They had turned him into a target of strategy, and that meant the rules of engagement had shifted again. So Roy shifted with them. He expanded his outreach. Quietly, without fanfare, he began hosting informal dinners in his workshop on weekends, small gatherings of neighbors who had grown uneasy with the direction things were heading. No politics, no speeches, just food, stories, and space. People came, slowly at first, then steadily. They talked about their own frustrations, their own fears of overreach, of being labeled problematic for simply existing with values not packaged for mass approval. Roy listened more than he spoke. He served coffee, passed plates, and let people rediscover something they didn't realize they'd lost. Community that didn't need to be filtered through a PR committee. And then came the unexpected moment, the one no one, including Roy, could have predicted. One evening, just before dusk, a woman knocked on his door. Early 40s, neatly dressed, nervous. She introduced herself as Marlene Harker, a former city zoning officer. She had retired early, quietly, after clashing with developers over transparency. She didn't want money. She didn't want attention. She wanted him to see something. She handed him a folder filled with correspondence between Karen and a private equity firm, including minutes from a closed-door meeting held months before her election. The documents revealed intent. Not suspicion, not speculation. Intent. Karen had promised to reclaim and repurpose underutilized legacy plots in exchange for infrastructure funding and future advisory roles. Roy's home wasn't just inconvenient. It was the first domino. Roy thanked her quietly. She asked him not to use her name. He promised. But now, the final line had been crossed. It wasn't about community anymore. It wasn't even about values. It was about profit, manipulated systems, hidden agendas dressed in public good. Roy didn't react with rage. He simply documented, filed, strategized. The case was still pending. The storm had not yet peaked, but he was no longer defending. He was preparing to strike back, with truth, with proof, and with everything the people trying to silence him had never counted on. That he wouldn't be afraid, that he wouldn't be alone, and that he knew exactly how to fight when the gloves came off. The courtroom was modest in size, its walls lined with bland portraits of retired judges and forgotten city officials, the lighting fluorescent and slightly too cold, the air stale in the way only old municipal buildings managed to maintain. Roy sat at the long wooden table beside Bryce, his suit clean and pressed, his expression calm, unwavering. There were no theatrics in his demeanor, no anger or defiance, only stillness, the quiet focus of someone who had spent his life doing things the hard way because the hard way was the honest one. Across from him sat Karen, flanked by two attorneys and a man in a navy blue blazer who didn't speak but observed everything like a hawk sizing up the next carcass. She looked polished, composed, performative as always, a tight-lipped smile fixed to her face like a badge. It wasn't arrogance. It was strategy. She believed she had orchestrated enough plausible deniability, crafted a story dense enough with ambiguity and bureaucracy to drown the truth beneath technicalities. What she hadn't counted on was that Roy had not come to the hearing alone. He had come with documentation, witnesses, statements, and something far more dangerous to her than anger, a coherent timeline that exposed her plans without embellishment or conjecture. The judge, a middle-aged woman with an even voice and a reputation for precision, opened the proceedings with the expected formalities. Karen's legal team presented first, their arguments packaged in sterile legalese. They described Roy's property as a locus of disruptive community anxiety, framed his cookout as ideologically suggestive and implicitly exclusionary, and referred to his firearm displays, never accessed, always secured, as visible triggers of generational trauma. Their tone never wavered, but it became increasingly clear that what they offered in language they lacked in substance. They cited no actual violations of law, no measurable harm, only aggregated perceptions and theoretical discomforts. It was a case built on impressions, on the suggestion that modern safety could only exist when sanitized of anything that could be misread. When it was Bryce's turn, he didn't rush. He moved like a craftsman laying foundation, one clear point at a time. He introduced the original neighborhood charter, the absence of any legitimate rule prohibiting Roy's displays, the legal documentation for the cookout's location and conduct, and the official responses from city departments verifying that no codes had been broken. Then he shifted tone, slowly, and unveiled the deeper narrative. The redevelopment effort disguised as community concern. He entered into evidence the anonymous documents provided by Marlene, the meeting notes, the internal emails, the strategic targeting language used by Karen in her correspondence with the development group. The courtroom shifted noticeably at that moment, the air thickening with the weight of something finally being named. The judge's pen moved faster. Karen's lawyers whispered urgently. Karen herself leaned forward, no longer smiling. Then came the testimony. Not from Roy, from others. A firefighter who had attended the cookout and attested to its peaceful nature. A city official who confirmed the improper usage of the expired site review credentials. A neighbor who admitted he had been pressured into signing the petition without understanding its implications. Each person added another nail in the coffin of Karen's defense, not by attacking her, but by calmly stating facts that eroded the illusion she had constructed. And then, finally, Bryce called Roy. Not to defend himself, but to describe why he had done what he did. Roy stood, adjusted his jacket, and spoke in a voice that was firm but unhurried. He didn't speak of rights in grand terms or try to cast himself as a hero. He simply described what the guns meant, how each piece in his collection carried a memory, a story, a trace of family history that could not be replicated or replaced. He described how the neighborhood had changed, not because people moved in, but because meaning had been stripped from objects, history recast as threat, and tradition painted as obstruction. He spoke of his wife, how they had built the home together, how she had once planted the same rose bushes that still bloomed near the porch. He spoke of the note left on his doormat, the nails in his driveway, the silence from neighbors who once waved. And finally, he spoke of the cookout, not as protest, but as the last language he knew that could say, "I am still here. I still belong." When he finished, the room was silent. The judge didn't speak right away. She took several minutes reviewing her notes, flipping back and forth between documents. When she finally looked up, her tone was neutral but decisive. She dismissed the case against Roy in full, citing lack of legal standing, procedural irregularities, and the introduction of unregulated administrative behavior by the committee under Karen's leadership. Furthermore, she instructed that the development group in question would be referred for city-level ethics review based on the documents provided, and recommended an external audit of the neighborhood's board practices. She did not rebuke Karen personally. She didn't have to. The ruling did that on its own. Karen didn't speak to Roy as she left the courtroom. She gathered her things quickly, her face now tight not with performance but with calculation, already adjusting to her loss, already retreating to wherever people like her go to reframe defeat as persecution. Roy didn't gloat. He simply nodded to Bryce, shook hands with the witnesses, and walked out into the afternoon light that somehow felt more open, more earned. But the true culmination wasn't the ruling. It came a week later when Roy received a letter in his mailbox, not from a court or a board or a developer, but from a neighbor, handwritten, no return address. It read only this: "I didn't know what was happening until you made us look. I'm sorry I didn't stand up sooner. Thank you for not giving up." Roy folded the letter and placed it in the same file where he kept the deed to his house and the first picture of his wife in front of their newly built porch. He stood on that same porch, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. The world hadn't changed. Karen's kind would try again somewhere else, but here, for now, dignity had held. Not through shouting, not through spectacle, but through one man who refused to be quietly rewritten. The weeks that followed moved quietly, not with celebration or noise, but with the slow resettling of a neighborhood that had come close to unraveling. There were no announcements, no headlines, no meetings where anyone stood up and admitted what had been done. But the signs were there if one knew where to look. The flags that once staked Roy's property like claims in a war zone disappeared overnight. The portal website, the one with the coded language of compliance and tension metrics, went offline without a word, its pages redirecting to a generic maintenance screen. The committee meetings stopped appearing in the weekly bulletin, and Karen, once the centerpiece of every neighborhood initiative, no longer walked her sequined leashed dog past Roy's driveway. There was no resignation letter, but within a month a new acting chair was named. Someone quieter, less ambitious, more interested in tree trimming schedules than property control narratives. No one mentioned the hearings. No one mentioned the cookout. But eyes lingered longer now when they passed Roy's yard, not with suspicion, but with acknowledgement. Silent nods, a cautious thumbs up from across the street, the return of hesitant waves that had been missing for months. Roy didn't change much. He still worked in his shed, still oiled the metal of long-inherited history, still brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and still preferred quiet days where nothing particularly happened. But something had shifted, not in what he did, but in what he represented. There was weight in his presence now, the kind that wasn't asked for, but had been earned. People stopped by more often, not in droves, not to pay tribute, but with excuses. A neighbor needed help fixing a gate. A teenager wanted to borrow a tool and returned it the same afternoon, along with a thank you note written with actual effort. A local teacher invited Roy to speak briefly at her class on history. Not the kind in textbooks, but the kind that fit in a hand and carried stories heavier than their steel frames. Roy accepted, quietly, without flourish. He wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. He just didn't say no anymore. He understood now what legacy really meant, not just what you leave behind, but what you insist on preserving when it would be easier to stay quiet. The gun collection remained untouched in his basement, each item cleaned, locked, documented. Not a monument, not a shrine, just truth with trigger guards. The sculpture in his yard stayed too. The old revolver embedded in iron, now less a target of debate and more a point of quiet reflection. People who once scowled at it now slowed their steps and looked longer. No one asked about its removal again. Bryce checked in from time to time, though the legal battles had settled. They spoke less about cases and more about weather, roads, old books, and the stubbornness of city bureaucracy. Roy never asked for compensation. He didn't want it. What had been won couldn't be priced. It lived in the fact that his home still stood as it always had, that the creeping erosion of manufactured regulation had been stopped, not by resistance alone, but by structure, by reason, by the strength of not blinking when told to step aside. As summer faded, the commons lawn where the cookout had been held grew lush again, greener than it had looked in years. Children played there without cautionary glances from their parents, and more than once Roy saw folding chairs set up on Saturday afternoons for impromptu picnics or birthday gatherings. No one asked permission anymore. They didn't need to. The space had been reclaimed not through vote or ordinance, but through presence. It belonged to the people again, not to charters or consultants or metrics written to justify decisions already made behind closed doors. One afternoon in late August, as Roy tended to his rose bushes, a man approached him. Middle-aged, well-kept, unfamiliar. He introduced himself as someone new to the area, just moved in 3 streets over, and said he'd heard a little story about Roy. Not from gossip, not from online posts, just something passed between neighbors, a quiet legend that didn't use words like battle or heroism, but implied them in the way it lingered. The man smiled a little awkwardly and asked if Roy had any advice for someone trying to figure out where the lines were drawn in a place like this. Roy didn't answer right away. He wiped his hands on a rag, looked down the street where the sun was starting to stretch shadows across the asphalt, then finally said, "Lines don't stay where they are unless someone keeps standing on them. Doesn't mean you have to yell. Just means you don't move when someone pretends they have the right to push." The man nodded, thanked him, and left. And Roy, once again alone in his yard, watched the quiet unfold, not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that follows resolution. He wasn't waiting for another fight. He wasn't hoping for one either, but if it came, he knew the ground wouldn't shake under him the same way again. Because now, the neighborhood remembered what it meant to have someone who didn't back down, someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard, someone who held the line, not for glory, not for attention, but because it was the only honest thing left to do.